We are on DAF Dalet at the very top, and we were talking about the importance of using Lashon Naki, of using a proper language, not using unsightly words, and we were also talking about the importance of not being the bearer of bad tidings, and it's in this context that we learn the next piece of Gemara. Rav bar Achva de Rabbi Chia ubar Achte. Rav was the nephew of Rabbi Chia from two sides. See, Rabbi Chia had he had a brother, he had a half brother, and he had a half sister from two, I guess his father had married a woman, and she brought a child with him. I'm just trying to think how it works. There were two half brothers and half sisters. In other words, a half brother and a half sister got married because they were not related. They were related through Rabbi Chia. In other words, Rabbi Chia was the common link between the two of them, but they were completely unrelated. So how would that work?
His father had a previous child with another marriage, and his mother, before he was born, his mother had a previous child with another marriage.
Yes, the mother had a previous child with another marriage. Exactly. Very good. Thank you, Mark. So Rav was the nephew of Rabbi Chia from a man named Aibu, which was Rabbi Chia's half brother, and it was also Rabbi Chia's half sister was the mother of Rav. So he was related from both sides, from his mother's side and his father's side. And they hadn't seen each other for a long time. So Kisalik Lahasam Amrle Aibu Kayam. So when Rabbi Chia finally came to visit Rav, he said, "Tell me, is your father Aibu alive?" So Amrle Ima Kayemes. So I'm learning like Rashi. There are different ways to learn this Gemara, but Rashi learns that Rav was asking him as a challenge. He says, "What? You're not asking me if my mother's alive? Why are you only asking me about my father?" So Amrle, okay, Ima Kayemes. So then Rabbi Chia says, "Okay, fine. So is your mother alive?" So Amrle, Aibu Kayam. So then he said, "Well, why aren't you asking me? Why asking me about my mother? Why not asking me about my father?" In other words, clearly he was being evasive because he didn't want to be the bearer of bad tidings that actually both of his parents had passed away. And it had happened some time ago, but because there was no texting or email, right? Rabbi Chia, who was living in Eretz Yisrael, and Rav was in Bavel, they didn't have a chance to communicate. So Amrle L'Shameh, so Rabbi Chia, when he hears this, he realizes that both his half brother and half sister have been nifter. So he says to his attendant, "Chalotz li minoli, take off my shoes, v'holich kelei achrei lebeis hamerchatz, and then carry all of my stuff to the bathhouse, because that's where I want to go." And so the Gemara now says, Shma mina tlos. From this story, you learn three things. Shma mina, avel asr b'ne'ilas sandal. One thing you learn is that an avel has to take off his shoes, not allowed to wear shoes. Shma mina shmur rechoka inu nehegas el yom echad. Also, the other thing that you learn is that Reb Chia only had to conduct himself in avelos for one day, and not for all 7 days, because it was what's called a shmur rechoka, which means that he had heard about it after 30 days had elapsed from the time of the Petira. And Ushma Mina Mixas Hayom Kekulo. And the third thing that you learn is that not even a full day of Avelos is noheg. Even a portion of the day is sufficient, because you see that Reb Chia took off his shoes, and then, like in an hour, he was going to go to the Beis HaMerchas. It wasn't even going to be a full day of Avelos. So those are the three things you learn from that story. Now, in the context of...
There was a fourth thing. Lashon Nakia, or bear a bad news.
Right. That's true. Why the Gemara doesn't say that? I guess because it's that's really a moral imperative. It's not necessarily. I guess it's not in the same realm of as a halachic imperative, but more of a moral imperative. In any event, the next we also learned that when a person uses coarse language, that sometimes is an indication that they come from a certain pedigree, an improper pedigree. Because remember, we learned that case about the Kohen who said, they gave me or one of the Talmidim said, that learning left me as exhausted as an exhausted pig, right? And so we said that was a sign that he was not a proper Talmud. So in the same vein, the Gemara says you can tell where a person comes from the language that they use. Hahu da'amar dunu dini. So a person that in all of his business activities, anytime he had a conflict, he was like a lawyer. He said, "Okay, let's go litigate." Right?
He was litigious.
He was litigious. He every time there was a conflict, he said, "Okay, let's go to Beis Din and settle it." Instead of trying to work it out, he says, "Let's go to a Din Torah." So Amri Shma Mina Midan Kaasi. You see from here that this guy must hail from the tribe of Dan. Dichsiv Dan Yadin Amo Ki Achad Shiftei Yisrael. As it says that Dan shall judge his people like one of the tribes of Israel, meaning that he's a litigious individual. Hahuda have a ka'azul ve'amar akef yama asisni bira'asa. He says there was another fellow who loved the ocean. He said, if I had enough money, I would build my palatial estate on an oceanfront property. Because he just loved the ocean. So badku va'ashkachuhu de mizvulun kaasi. So they checked and they discovered that he had some lineage coming from the tribe of Zevulun. Dichsiv Zevulun lechof yamim yishkon. As it says in the pasuk, that the Zevulun will dwell on the ocean front. My wife must come from Zevulun because every time we go on, I offer to go on vacation. She says, "I want to go by the water." All right. Anyway.
Malibu.
Malibu. Oxnard.
Tribe.
Yeah, that's right. Everyone's got a little Zavulin in them, right? Especially from California. Okay.
Was a big shame.
Yeah, right. All right, so now the Gemara says, V'hashta de kaimalon de l'kulei alma, or tuhu. So now let's go back to our discussion. We got in this discussion because the word or, as the first word of our Mishnah, of our Maseches, means the nighttime. So then you're supposed to do B'dikas Chametz at night. So the question the Gemara is going to examine is, Mechti, Bein l'Rebbe Yehuda, Bein l'Rebbe Meir, Chametz eino aser ela mishei shos u'lamayla. Well, we're going to see a machlokas between Rebbe Meir and Rebbe Yehuda in just in a few minutes, which are going to say, at what time does a person have to dispose of all chametz? But everyone agrees that the actual Isser Deoraisa of having chametz in your possession is only from Chatzos Hayom, from midday of Erev Pesach and onwards. You're allowed to have chametz in the morning of Erev Pesach. So the question is, v'nivdok b'shis, why don't you just check within that hour before Chatzos, in the 6th hour, when it was between 11 and 12, and using our clocks. So the Gemara says, V'chi temas reason makdimin lemitzvos. Maybe you'll tell me it's because, well, the person who wants to show his excitement about doing the mitzvah should do the mitzvah as early as possible. So therefore you should do it already at the beginning of the day, at night, on the night of the 14th. But the Gemara says no, because nivdok mitzafra, all you see from the imperative of Zrizin is that you should do it as early in the morning as possible, because the chsivu vayom hashmini yimol b'sar laso. We learn this, the precedent for the mitzvah of Zrizin is from Bris Milah. The Torah says on the 8th day he shall be circumcised. V'tanya kol hayom kulo kosher lamila ela shezrizin makdim lemitzvos. That we learn in the Brisa that the whole day is kosher to do a Bris Milah, but to show your alacrity and your excitement about doing the mitzvah, you should do it as early as possible in the day. Shenemar vayashkem Avraham baboker, as it says by the Akedah that Avraham woke up early in the morning. So that's our question. The question is, why don't you do B'dikas Chametz? I mean, even at the most, because of Zrizin Makdimin, the earliest you should do it would be in the morning, like not the night before. Like a bris. Right, like a bris. So, Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, B'shah sheb'nei adam mitzuyin b'vateihen, ve'or haner yafel b'dika. So he gives two answers. He says two reasons why you have to do B'dikas Chametz at night. One is because you want to do it at a time when people are home. No one's home in the middle of the day, right? Unless you're a man of leisure. Right, you're working during the day, so how can you expect a person to b'dikas chametz?
Well, that's not the middle of the day. We're talking about early in the morning. That's not...
Even then, you're off to work.
Busy.
You're busy. You're off to work. Yeah, you got a lot. You got things to do, people to see, places to go to. And also, the other thing is that the b'dika is supposed to be la'or haner. Supposed, as the Mishnah had said, you're supposed to be able to have a focused light. And you can only accomplish that when it's at nighttime. Otherwise, the candle is completely ineffective when you do b'dikas chametz during the day. Amar Abaye. Abaye says, Hilkach haitzur v'merabanan l'liftach be'idnei be'orta detleiser denagi arbeisar dilmo mashkach le'shamaite v'asilim nui mimitzvah. Abaye says, and this is a very famous halacha that's codified in Shulchan Aruch, that if you're a Talmud Chacham, you should not begin a session of study in the Beis Medrash on the evening or going into the evening of Erev Pesach, because we're worried that even though you start learning before before nighttime sets in, you may get so engrossed in your studies that you'll prolong your studies and you'll forget all about doing bedikas chametz. And that's why there's actually a halacha that you have to leave the base medrash early in order to do bedikas chametz. Ba'al minei Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak hamaskir bayis lechavero be'arba'as ar almi livdok ala maskir livdok the chamir didehu odil malasocha livdok disura birshu seikoi. The question was raised as follows: if Reuven owns a home and he rents it to Shimon for Pesach, and Shimon takes possession of it, sometime before Pesach, whose obligation is it to check? Now here the question is that Shimon takes possession of it on Erev Pesach itself. Now this question does come up on a practical basis all the time. Right, Danny, I think you had this shaila, right? When you rent a condo in Florida for Pesach. Was it you who asked me this question, or somebody else?
Me.
All right, maybe it was you. So a guy goes and rents a condo in Florida from a private party. He's going down there for Pesach. They have these catering services in Florida where they'll make all of Pesach for you and deliver it to your home, right? But you're renting someone's private condo. You fly in, you come in Erev Pesach in the morning. Whose responsibility is it to make sure that there's no chametz in the house? On the one hand, you could say it's al hamaskir. It's the owner's, it's the landlord's obligation because the chamira didehu, because after all it's his chametz that's lying around the house. Odilma al hasocher livdok the yisura birshu seikoi, or maybe no, or maybe the rabbis impose the obligation of checking on the renter because he's the one that's going to be living with this stuff over Pesach. Now I just want to point out something very important before we go any further. It's very important to realize that the mitzvah of bedikas chametz is only a mitzvah derabanan. Midioraisa, there's an obligation to remove chametz from your possession. That's what we call the isser of bal yirah and bal yimatzah. You may not have any chametz in your purview or in your possession over Pesach. If it's someone else's chametz, it's not my problem. And furthermore, I can dispense with my obligation by just making a declaration of hefker. I can say kol chamira v'chamia. I can say every chametz that is in my possession is hereby nullified, and I declare it to be ownerless. And I fulfill my obligation midioraisa. I don't have to clean my house. I don't have to check my house. I don't have to do nothing. Right? Don't tell that to your wives. They'll go nuts. They're going to say the rabbis are out to get them. Right? But the reality is, it's only an obligation from the Chachamim that they require us to remove chametz physically from our homes, even after we've made it hefker, lest we find it on Pesach, forget about the prohibition of chametz and inadvertently eat something on Pesach, or at least take possession of it. So this question that the Gemara is raising is, granted, if I'm renting your house and I find a loaf of bread in your cupboard, it's not my loaf of bread. It's your loaf of bread. Or maybe you made it hefker, but the problem is, maybe the Chachamim would obligate me to do biur chametz, to get rid of the chametz, so that if Pesach comes, I don't inadvertently eat a slice of bread. Or maybe it's the landlord's obligation, because after all, it's his bread. So whose obligation is it? So Tashma, listen to the Brisa. Hamaskir bayis lachavero al hasocher lasos lo mezuzah. That let's look at a precedent from the halachas of mezuzah. If Reuven is the landlord, Shimon is the renter. Reuven rents out his house to Shimon. So Shimon has the obligation to put up a mezuzah. So you see, it's the tenant's obligation, not the landlord's obligation. So say to over here, it's the tenant's obligation to check for chametz. So the Gemara says, Hasam ha'amar of misharshi mezuzas chovas adorhi hachamai. So the Gemara says, no, that's not necessarily a good comparison, because over there, the obligation of mezuzah is on the resident, is on the person who's actually living there. But here, you have an opposing compelling argument, which is, it's not my chametz, so why should I have to dispose of it? So Amr Lahu Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Tanina. So Rav Nachman says, look at this brisa. Hamaskir bayis lachavero imad shelo masalo maftechos chal arba'asar al hamaskir livdog ve'im misha masalo maftechos chal arba'asar al hasocher livdog. So the brisa resolves the issue, and it just says it's all a question of timing. When did the tenant receive the keys to the premises? When did he take possession as a tenant? If he takes possession as a tenant before the onset of the 14th, before the time for Bedikas Chametz, so then it's his obligation to do Bedikas Chametz. But if he only arrives the morning of Erev Pesach, at which case he only took possession after the mandated mitzvah was instituted, so then it's the landlord's obligation to do bedikas chametz. And that's the general guideline, that if you come to a place and you get there before the night of the 14th, so then taka, even if you go to a hotel, you still have to do bedikas chametz in your hotel room. Okay, Bo minei Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak hamaskir bayis lechavero be'abas ar cheskaso baduk o ein cheskaso baduk. So the Gemara now asks, based on this, we know that if I take possession on the 14th during the daytime, it's the landlord's responsibility to check and remove chametz. What if I arrive the morning of the 14th? May I assume that because the guy is an Orthodox Jew, he dispensed with his responsibility and he properly checked and disposed of chametz? Or am I not allowed to make that assumption? So l'may nafkamina l'shayale. So the Gemara says, why is this a relevant question? Just ask the landlord. Just ask him. He'll tell you whether he checked it or not. The Gemara answers, the lesse lahai de l'shiyule. So the issue is, let's say the landlord is not available. You can't reach him by cell phone. He's turned off his phones. He's skipped town. And now you want to know, is the house baduk? Has it been checked? Has it been cleaned out or not? Are we matriach, the tenant who just arrived, without any knowledge of whether or not the house has been properly cleaned for chametz? Do we obligate him to clean it? So Amar Lahu Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Tinisuha. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, well, let me bring the following brisa as proof. Hakol ne'emanim al bir chametz afilu nashim afilu avadim afilu ketanim. That the brisa says that everyone is trusted to testify that a house has been cleaned from chametz. And that's true for women, it's true for slaves, it's true for minors. So the Gemara says, my time and mehimni. Now, normally, these people's testimony is not admissible in court, so why do you believe them? Lav mishum dechezkaso baduk. Dekesaver hakol chaverim hemetzel bedikas chametz. It must be that this brisa maintains that any Orthodox Jew, even an illiterate Orthodox Jew, meaning an Am Haaretz, is considered to be a chaver, which means a literate, meticulous Jew, when it comes to the laws of bedikas chametz. We may not be able to trust them as far as tithes are concerned, like we know the law of Demai, but when it comes to bedikas chametz, that's something that is universal. Every Babi, every Zaidi makes a Pesach Seder. Everyone knows how to clean for chametz. No matter how literate or illiterate the person is, we can always assume that they checked for chametz. That's what the Gemara is suggesting at this point. The Tanya, as the Brisa says, Chaver shemeis v'niach megurim alei peros afilu hein b'nei yom harehin b'cheskas mesukanim. That, as we know, once a person has the status of a chaver, as a literate, meticulous Jew, then, for example, if a person dies and he was a chaver, which means we knew he was meticulous in this mitzvah of tithes, and you find in his estate a box of produce, even if it was newly harvested, you can assume that since it's in the granary, it was tithed, because we have a chazaka that no person who's meticulous in observance is going to allow something to remain unkosher in his house. So therefore, we can assume that this house was checked, it was cleaned out from chametz, and therefore the Gemara wants to argue the fact that you could admit the testimony of people who are puzzled for edus is a raya that you can rely on the chazaka that the house was checked and cleaned properly. The Gemara says that's not proof. Umimai dilma shiny hacha mishum dekar mihani. But maybe no. Maybe the only reason why we assume that the house was cleaned was because of this woman's or this child's testimony. But without that testimony, we wouldn't be able to rely on a chazaka. Frek the Gemara, atu amira dahani midi meshashe isbei. You mean to tell me that their testimony counts for anything? We know, we just explained that their testimony is inadmissible. So why would you say that it's based on their testimony? So elamai decheskaso baduk. So the Gemara says, well, then what's the alternative? What are you suggesting? That we can assume that the house has already been cleaned and checked and cleaned, and that's the reason why we admit their testimony. So hakol ne'emanim kolavat b'cheskas bedukim bar basar mi boilei. So then the brisa is misleading. It shouldn't have said that everyone is believed when they say that the house was cleaned. It should have said that everyone is assumed to have cleaned the house. It's completely irrelevant whether they testify or not. So really, what the brisa should have said is that there's an assumption that everyone has cleaned their house. That's what it should have said. So elamai mishum amira dahani. So the fact that the brisa doesn't say that, it's because that they actually testified and we accept their testimony. So let's make an inference in the other direction. Halo amri hani lo. That if they would not have testified, then you would not be able to assume that the house is clean. So the Gemara is now suggesting, let's just say the opposite. Let's infer from this brisa that without the testimony of at least somebody, then you have to assume that the house was not checked properly. And maybe but the point of the Gemara exercise at this point is make up your mind. From this brisa, you should be able to infer one or the other. You should be able to either infer that there's a chazaka that the house has been cleaned, or infer that no, that without testimony there's a chazaka that the house has not been cleaned. But infer something.
There's the Gemara. The BAYT didn't declare that their house is clean in the morning of Pesach.
The word chazaka means an assumption, a reliable assumption. You can make assumption about people. It has nothing to do with based in. Right? There's a question of assuming that people behave in a certain way. That's what the word chazaka means. Okay? You with me so far?
Assumption.
So can we make the assumption that people properly clean their houses Erev Pesach? The Brisa says that you can rely on the testimony of a woman or a child that the house has been cleaned.
That's the testimony that they could give, that we could.
Yeah, but it's not in a court of law. They're just, you know what I'm saying? They're just, when someone says the house is clean, you can rely on it.
Call them on.
So the question therefore is, it doesn't make any sense. Either this kind of testimony is not admissible in court, so why should that testimony count for anything in halacha? So either therefore it's because you rely on the chazaka without their testimony, or the only reason you accept it is because of their testimony, in which case you cannot make assumptions without testimony. But it's got to be one way or the other, the Gemara says. Mm-hmm. So tifshem minei den chezkas so baduk. So then I'm up against the clock. Therefore, let's assume that there's an assumption that it hasn't been checked. So the Gemara, or that let's say the chazaka the other way, that you don't rely on the chazaka. So the Gemara says lo. Really, you can't make any inference either way. Really, I'll tell you that you can make an assumption. Without any testimony whatsoever, you can assume that the house was properly checked. Because every Jew cleans for Pesach. But what's the Brisa referring to in this case? The Brisa is talking about a case where you know for a fact that the landlord did not check for
because he wasn't in town.
Either he wasn't in town, or someone said he told us that he didn't clean. Because we know for a fact that he didn't.
Somewhere else.
We know for a fact he didn't clean. When we know for a fact he didn't clean, that's where we can rely on the testimony of a woman or child that the house was cleaned. And this woman comes along and says, even though the landlord is out of town, I personally cleaned the house and made sure there was no chametz. Now, normally we don't rely on that testimony because mahu detema lo lehimninu rabbanon. You might argue that the chachamim should not admit such testimony, but kamash malon kevan de bedikas chametz b'derabbanon hu de midioraisa bebitul ba'almasagi lehimnuhu rabbanon b'derabbanon. The answer is, says the Gemara, since bedikas chametz is only a rabbinic requirement, because midioraisa, even if the house is filled with chametz, as long as the landlord made it tefker, you fulfilled your Torah obligation. The Chachamim created a leniency, and they said, we're not going to require you to do the mitzvah derabbanan of bedikas chametz as long as you have someone testifying that the house was cleaned. That's all you require. Yes,
I was going to give an answer like that. One of the reasons it's a derabbanan and it's a sveka, because it's a suffix whether it was clean, and it's a suffix whether the renter or the owner has to do it. So there's two suffixes.
Okay, if you want to phrase it as a sveka, maybe that's one way of phrasing it. I'm not sure. You'd have to think it through, but it's an interesting idea. Okay, ibayiluhu. So now the next question is raised. Hamaskir bayis lachavero bechezkas baduk umitzo she'eno baduk mahu. Now here, this is actually a choshen mishpat law. This is a tort law, Rabbi say. This has to do with financial responsibility. I signed a contract with my landlord. In other words, I took possession of a condo in Florida, and the agreement was that he was going to provide me with a clean condo, cleaned of chametz. I get there, and there's loaves of bread strewn all over the place. Right? There's chametz everywhere. So now the question is this a legally binding contract, or do I have the opportunity as a tenant to say, I'm backing out of the deal because this was... It was a mekach tos. How do you translate mekach tos in legal terminology?
Mistaken transaction.
A mistaken transaction. Mistaken transaction. So me, habi kemekach tos olo. Is this a mistaken transaction which I can therefore renege on or not? So tashma, It would be a great loophole if you don't like the view, right? You can say,
well, where are you going to go at the last minute?
Right.
Air Pesach.
So imagine a guy pulls out a piece of bread from his pocket, puts it on the couch, and says, you see? It's a mekach tos. I want
a better room.
I want a better room, right? So, right, upgrade me. Like in the old days, they used to take out cockroaches and put it in the food. Take a piece of bread. And, so Toshma, the Amar Abaye, as Abaye says, Lo mi baya ba'asra de lo yahavi agra ubad ki denichale leinish lekiyumi mitzvah begufei, el afilu ba'asra de yahavi agra ubad ki denichale leinish lekiyumi mitzvah b'mamone. So Abaye says, look, there are two different kinds of cultures in the Jewish society. One culture is where people enjoy doing the mitzvah themselves and cleaning the house themselves. There's another culture, more privileged class of Jews, that they hire people to clean the house for them. In both of those scenarios, not only do we say that a person would like to do the mitzvah himself instead of having someone else do the mitzvah, but we even say, even among privileged Jews, they would rather pay someone to do the mitzvah for them instead of having someone else paid to do the mitzvah. In other words, that Abaye's answer is no. You cannot claim that just because you found a chametz dirty house that it's a mekach tos, it's a mistaken transaction. Because even when you do find chametz, we assume that you want to do the mitzvah. You want to clean the house from Pesach. You want to clean out the condo. And therefore, even if you find chametz there, even whether you're a type of person who likes to clean himself or herself, or whether you're the kind of person who likes to hire someone to clean, you cannot renege on the deal, because we assume that either you want to clean yourself or you'd like to hire someone to clean because it's a privilege to spend money in order to do a mitzvah.
Wow.
So the landlord can turn around and tell you, sorry, I know I told you the house was going to be clean, but I know that you're a pious Jew and you love to do mitzvahs, so I didn't want to deprive you of that great privilege of cleaning my condo for Pesach, so I left you a dirty condo.
He's my husband, too.
That's right. That's right. That's right. I made a point of emptying out the vacuum cleaner bags all over the place so that you should have a special enjoyment of doing the mitzvah. Okay. Tanan Hasan. Reb Meir Omer, Ochlin kol chamesh v'sorfen b'tchila sheish, and Reb Yehuda Omer, Ochlin kol arba v'tolin kol chamesh v'sorfen b'tchila sheish. Okay, so we have a Mishnah, we're going to see that shortly. It's in our parak. The Mishnah brings a machlokas between Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda. Everyone agrees that the Isser D'Oraisa of chametz begins at chatzos, but Reb Meir says you can eat the entire 5th hour, and you have to burn the beginning of the 6th hour using our clocks, just as just to give you the illustration. Using the clocks that we use in the Western world, from 10 to 11, you're allowed to eat chametz, and from 11 to 12, you have to dispose of the chametz, right? And Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Ochlin kol arba v'tolin kol chamesh v'sorfen b'tchila sheish. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you can eat the 4th hour, you have to not eat during the 5th hour, but you're not obligated to dispose yet of the chametz, and during the beginning of the 6th hour, you dispose of the chametz. So Rabbi Yehuda's position is from 9 to 10, you can eat. From 10 to 11, you can't eat anymore, but you don't have to dispose yet of the chametz, and shortly after 11 o'clock, you have to actually burn the chametz. Dekuli al mamiha chametz mishesho sulamala aser. But everyone clearly holds that from chatzos hayom and onwards, it's aser to the Torah prohibits having chametz. So minolam, where do we get this from? Where do we get this idea that not only is chametz aser on Pesach, but it's also aser part of Erev Pesach as well? So Amar Abaye trei kroi ksiv, because we have 2 psukim in the Torah. Ksiv shivas yomim solo yimotze bevatecha. The first pasuk says that for 7 days you may not have any leaven in your house. Now, that pasuk in and of itself would indicate to me that for the entire 7 days of Pesach, no chametz is allowed, and no further pasuk would be necessary. So the second pasuk seems to be so totally superfluous. On the first day, remove leaven from your house. Now that's already implicit in the first pasuk. So what's the purpose of the second pasuk? So that tells me that it's the first day before Pesach begins, which is on Erev Pesach. I have to remove chametz from my house. So frek the Gemara, maybe not. Maybe that second pasuk is not telling me that Erev Pesach is asur for chametz, but it's telling me that I have to get rid of chametz the night of Pesach. the night of the 15th. Why? Because I might have thought, because it says in the first pasuk, Shivas Yamim, only for 7 days may you not have leaven. So maybe days is to be taken literally, and the prohibition of chametz does not start until the day of the 15th, but not at night. And that's why I need the kamashmal and afilu leilos. Therefore, I would need the pasuk to tell me, the second pasuk to tell me that even the night of the 15th, I also have to get rid of chametz.
That's the first Seder.
So, So the Seder, who's to say that the prohibition of chametz is linked to the mitzvah of Seder? Maybe I could have a Seder and have a loaf of bread on the table at the same time when I'm eating my matzah.
That's what the Gemara's question.
That's what the Gemara is entertaining as a possibility.
That's why you need ach. That's how you take the bread away.
Wait. So the Gemara says, Hahulo itztrichale. No, you would never think that. You know why? Because the ha'iskash hashbasa so'or la'achilas chametz, va'achilas chametz la'achilas matzah. He says, because the Torah connects A to B and B to C. A to B is that the obligation to remove chametz from your possession is linked scripturally to the prohibition of eating chametz. And B to C is the prohibition of eating chametz is scripturally linked to the obligation to eat matzah, which is for the night of Pesach. So, and where do you see this? So, Hashvasos or lachilas chametz dichsiv shivas yomim soli motze bivatechem ki kol ochel machametzes v'nichrasa. So the A to B link is, it says, for 7 days you may not have chametz in your possession, because anyone who eats chametz will get kares. So you see the prohibition of owning and the prohibition of eating are linked together. V'achilas chametz lachilas matzah, and where do you see that B to C is connected? That the prohibition of eating chametz and the mitzvah to eat matzah is linked. Dichsiv kol machmetzes lo sochela b'chol moshvosechem tochlu matzos. As it says in this pasuk, do not eat leaven, and in all of your dwellings eat matzah. So uchasiv bebe matzah ba'erev tochlu matzos. And it says with the mitzvah of matzah that there's davka mitzvah of matzah the night of the 15th at the Seder. So once I know that there's an obligation to eat matzah, I automatically know that there's a prohibition of ownership of chametz. So I don't need that second pasuk. So therefore that pasuk must be coming to teach me that even on Erev Pesach there's a prohibition of ownership of chametz. Ve'eim al-rabos leil yudala lebir. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, then why is the prohibition only start in the middle of the day? Maybe it should start already at the beginning of the 14th at night, that there's a prohibition of chametz. The Gemara says, bayom ksiv, because the pasuk says, ach bayom harishon. Only during the first day is the prohibition to own chametz. Ve'ema mitzafra, but maybe that prohibition starts at the morning, at dawn or sunrise. Maybe that's the time when the prohibition of owning chametz sets in. Wouldn't that be normal? So the Gemara answers, ach cholak. Answers the Gemara, no. The Torah pasuk says, ach bayom harishon. So the word ach, Rashi explains, is always a mi'ut, which means it's always coming to minimize or exclude something. Without the word ach, I would have told you the entire day of Erev Pesach. With the word ach, it's coming to teach you that no, only a half of the day of Pesach. Yes. Rashi, that's first explanation of Rashi. Second explanation of Rashi is the word ach. You can use a certain type of gematria, which Rashi calls, that it's called achas, bata, gif, and dachatz. And the type of gematria works like this. You space 7 letters from Aleph, and you get the letter Ches. From the letter Ches, you space 7 letters, and you get the letter Samech. And you do the same thing with Beis, you do the same thing with Gimel. So all of those letters are linked together. So the word Ach is linked to the word Chetz, which is like Chetzi. And that tells you that Chetzi Hayom, the word Ach means only half of the day is prohibited, not the full day is prohibited. It's a very strange hermeneutic derivation. Yes. That you use ach to teach you chetz, which is chetzi. Very interesting Rashi.
It's a chaf, it's not a chet.
Something to think about.
It's a chaf, though, not a chet.
That's
Yeah, ach is aleph chaf. So aleph connects to ches, and chaf connects to tzadi. Ches and tzadi. Chetz.
When you said they have bread.
Have a wonderful day.